At roughly the same time that the Romantic era was transpiring, not only in America, but in Europe and other places, another worldview came to the forefront, right about in the middle of the 19th century, and it just increased over time. So much so that it affects almost everything that we think about even today. And that worldview is the evolutionary worldview. We credit primarily Charles Darwin with getting that started. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything that Darwin said at that time is something that everybody goes along with today, even those who believe in an evolutionary way of looking at things. But Darwin and Darwinism, if we can call it that, has had multiple effects on our society. And so what I want to do is not focus on the scientific side of it so much, but I want to kind of focus on how believing a certain philosophy, in this case an evolutionary worldview, might affect various other things that happen in our society as well. Now, we do have to start with a concept that Darwin brings out here, which is that all things are the product of time plus chance plus matter, and that everything develops from simple to complex. Now, again, there are people today who have an evolutionary point of view who may not follow strictly what Darwin said right there. So he is the man, though, that gets it started, and everybody of an evolutionary standpoint at least does believe that over time, one way or another, things do constantly change, and the simple to complex is something that we've come to kind of agree upon as a society. Give enough time, and by chance, matter will change over time. Now, I believe that if you take the evolutionary philosophy and push it to its extreme, what you're going to get are certain results of evolutionary logic. We can start with the idea that there is no God that's now necessary because natural processes will explain everything. Why worry about having a God in charge of it? Now, that doesn't mean that everybody who believes in an evolutionary process does not believe in God, but the point here is God necessary? And basically, from many evolutionary points of view, no. You can throw a God in if you'd like to, but it's not really essential that God be there because the natural processes will make it happen by time, chance, matter, or whatever other mechanism that people might come up with. And so what this does, though, if there is no God, then the question is, who is man? Because the biblical concept, of course, is that man is a creature that is made specially in the image of God. Who God is has been transferred over to who man is in respect to the fact that we think, that we feel, that we choose. All of these things are part of the image of God. But if you remove God from the equation, man could be just a blob of tissue. In fact, that actually has been put forward. There was one particular organization at one point that favoring abortion that said, well, that child growing inside the womb is just a blob of tissue. So what is happening here is we're kind of depersonalizing man, and we're taking man and turning him into something other than what the biblical worldview would say that he is. So no God necessary. Natural processes could explain everything. Man is just a mass of chemicals or a blob of tissue. And if that is the case, if you carry this out even further, if there is no God, and therefore there is no one above us telling us what is right or wrong, there are no moral absolutes either. And people can kind of come up with their own concept of what right and wrong is all about. Everything then becomes relative. So these are the basic concepts, I think, that if you take it to the extreme, this is where you can end up with an evolutionary logic. For instance, there's formerly the man, Dr. Stephen Hawking, was a rather well-known scientist, and he wrote one time the following. He said, because there are laws such as gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. It is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going. There was also a Supreme Court justice by the name of Oliver Wendell Holmes, and Holmes was rather outspoken about his idea of the value of man, as we just got done talking about who is man if you carry the logic out all the way. Apparently Holmes is somebody who does carry that logic out, because he said this, he said, I see no reason for attributing to man a significance different in kind from that which belongs to a baboon or a grain of sand. I believe that our personality is a cosmic ganglion, which is like a giant nerve. Okay? Just as when certain rays meet and cross, there is a white light at the meeting point, but the rays go on after the meeting, as they did before. So when certain other streams of energy cross at the meeting point, the cosmic ganglion can frame a syllogism or wag its tail. And if you're trying to figure out what that means, what it comes down to is when this accidental thing happens, when man is an accidental thing, we might end up with man because you might end up with logical thought, a syllogism, or you end up something that just wags its tail. There's no telling. So in other words, it is kind of a chance thing when the energy decides to go a certain direction. Now, evolutionary thought led to a concept that was very popular, especially in the first part of the 20th century, called eugenics. Eugenics is based upon the idea that heredity is the key to the human future. And when you take eugenics theory, you see that it is tied very well to evolutionary thought. First of all, it starts off by saying we've got to improve the human stock and develop the best race. Now, just by using the term stock there, which is normally used for animals, we see again kind of a depersonalization of who man is, and they want to develop what they call the best race. So what you have to do, according to this perspective, is segregate inferior races to advance on their own evolutionary schedule. You see, they are all people, but some people have advanced faster than others evolutionarily, and so therefore the last thing you want to do is mix those particular races. And of course it starts from the concept that there are inferior races. And if there are inferior races, then by logic there are also superior races as well. What does this lead to? Certain eugenics legislation passed in some states in the United States during this time period. Marriage codes, and you say, what are those marriage codes all about? Well, it has to do with making sure that races don't mix, and making sure that whites marry whites and don't mix in with blacks and kind of lead to a degeneration of the population as a result of doing that. So you see what we have here is a basis for racism through this particular philosophy. Forced sterilization. When some people are considered to be not fit to be able to have children, well, we'll make sure they don't. And there were laws like that also. And then, of course, birth control. Now, birth control can be a controversial issue, and Christians are all over the map as far as birth control. But the point here within the eugenics legislation is to kind of make sure that certain groups of people do not proliferate. And that is one of the rationales behind the early birth control movement. And we'll get to a person pretty soon who's kind of in charge of that. Now, keep in mind, we're talking inferior and superior races here. This is the foundation for Nazi theories. Adolf Hitler was a thoroughgoing eugenicist. Maybe a lot of people are not familiar with that, but that is his basis for things. Now, again, you're not going to find too many people who are eugenicists today, because when Hitler turns out to be a eugenicist and he does what he does, it kind of makes people shy away from that. So nobody really of any importance or any major group today talks about eugenics specifically, because that ties them too much to a man like Hitler. Matter of fact, after World War II, you don't hear much about this anymore. But the concept can still be alive. Some people very much in favor of genetic engineering to sometimes create better people. Now again, this is a mixed bag, because obviously if you can do some genetic engineering to wipe out any kind of a disease that's in an embryo, that certainly would be a positive thing. But what if you're doing genetic engineering to create, again, a better race of people, if that is your concept? So again, there have to be limitations on these. There has to be a framework within which this operates, and that, to me, would have to be a more biblical framework of operation. Look at this particular poster from the early 20th century. It's eugenics propaganda, where it says, "Only healthy seed must be sown. Check the seeds of hereditary disease and unfitness by eugenics." Now, keep in mind, how do you define the term unfitness? Well, we've already seen what unfit is. There are some races that are inferior to other races from the eugenics standpoint. And then we have a person here, a woman by the name of Margaret Sanger, who starts, first of all, an organization called the Birth Control, but it changes over time into what we now call Planned Parenthood. And what a lot of people don't realize is that Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist as well. And those concepts were brought into the organization at a very early stage. Sanger's beliefs can be kind of summarized in this way. First of all, she believed in the elimination of human weeds. Now keep in mind, you start talking about people as weeds, and again, what you're doing here is you are demeaning certain types of people. What kind of people? Primarily for Sanger, certain minorities, and certainly blacks as well in the United States. There was even something in Planned Parenthood called the Negro Project, which was kind of intended through birth control to limit the number of children born. So the human weeds, according to Sanger, might need to be eliminated. The cessation of charity, meaning stopping charity. Now that sounds a little strange, perhaps. What's wrong with that? Well, from Sanger's point of view, if you start giving all kinds of aid to people who are always in trouble, they're not the kind of people that, shall we say, ought to survive. And yet we, by giving them charity, are propping them up and helping them survive when maybe they ought not to. So stop that kind of charity from her perspective. And officially here, specifically, the segregation of genetically inferior races, as we've already talked about with the whole concept of eugenics. Again, Sanger was in favor of that. Now, during her lifetime, abortion is not legal, so she doesn't actually come out and campaign for abortion. She's on the birth control side of things. But as time goes on, it's obvious that this is a belief that she has. Planned Parenthood at the present time is the foremost abortion provider in the world. And finally, Margaret Sanger believed in what she would call complete sexual freedom, which kind of throws out, does it not, all biblical standards of sexual morality. So this stems from her belief in an evolutionary concept called eugenics. Now, I hate to pick on one person all the time, but let's go back to Oliver Wendell Holmes again. I've already talked about him before. In a case before the Supreme Court in 1927, dealing with forced sterilization, a law that required forced sterilization, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of that, and the state could actually do it. In the decision, Oliver Wendell Holmes says this: "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." It's rather chilling for me to read something like that, because there's this underlying assumption that some people are just naturally not worthy, whereas the biblical concept of the image of God makes each person who ever comes into this world someone in the image of God and therefore inherently with worth. So this is going an entirely different direction. John Dewey is another person we need to look at carefully here. He's the father of progressive education, one of the signers of the Humanist Manifesto that came out in 1933. How is he affected by this, and how does it affect also the whole concept of education going forward from his time? What I want to start with is look at some of the key beliefs in that manifesto. Dewey's not only a signer, but he's also somebody who helped put this together. Here's some of the concepts that kind of stand out to me when it comes to religion. According to the manifesto, religious humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. So that is a denial of the biblical concept of God being the creator. It goes on to say, humanism asserts that the nature of the universe depicted by modern science makes unacceptable any supernatural or cosmic guarantees of human values. So science, according to the manifesto, throws God out. We looked at the scientific revolution in another session. That was not true for those scientists. Religious humanism considers the complete realization of human personality to be the end of man's life and seeks its development and fulfillment in the here and now. There's nothing after this. Here and now is all that matters. There will be no uniquely religious emotions and attitudes of the kind hitherto associated with belief in the supernatural. I mean, this is rather stark. This is rather, at least it's very honest, it's very forthright in what they are saying that they believe. You take Dewey's concepts and you apply them to education, And he believes things like this. First of all, eternal absolute truth does not exist. Now, if that's one of your foundational concepts for education, that changes education significantly. He believes in a child-centered, child-directed education, which kind of works itself out as teaching the child whatever the child feels like learning and not really directed from those who are the teachers. He believes experience is more important than book learning. There's always some truth. Experience is important. But you need some basis for that experience. You need some knowledge that might only come from books. And finally, he believed that schools ought to be set up as what he called embryonic communities. So we're just trying to show in the school how you live in society. And John Dewey was a socialist, something we'll talk about in the next episode. And Dewey believed that we needed to socialize in that way and get away from the individualistic way of looking at things. And then there's this other thing. Pragmatism. I mean, talk about a philosophy. What is pragmatism? Dictionary definition. Philosophy that regards the practical consequences, useful results of ideas as the test of their truthfulness, considers truth to be a process, meaning it's always changing. So truth is not something that is constant. Truth is something that changes. And use this word relativism to go along with it. Truth is therefore dependent upon time, place, and individual experience. Well, you know, the Bible, for instance, was written at a certain time in the past, in a certain place, and out of a people's individual experience. Well, today, we are in a different time, we are at a different place, and our individual experience is all different, so therefore, that's not really a guide for us. Relativism, pragmatism. Okay? Charles Sanders Peirce is a philosopher who is normally regarded as the founder of pragmatism. Peirce made the following comments. He says, first of all, thinking does not come naturally to man. And as I've told my students quite often, I think I agree with that point. Second, disturbances of life cause doubts which make men uncomfortable. Now, as a Christian, I can understand that also, because things come along in our life, they make us think and maybe kind of reevaluate what is truth and whatever. But the final point here is that relief comes through belief, which sounds good up to that point, but the substance of the belief is really unimportant. That's why it's pragmatism. Do whatever works for you. And truth for you can be different than truth for somebody else. Pragmatism has a direct effect on law and government when it goes into effect. When you start saying that law is just a process, there are no absolutes. Whereas law, prior to this time in American history and jurisprudence, is based upon eternal law first. And anything that violates eternal law is not valid law. That now changes. Government must constantly change to meet the needs of the people. That is okay. That's fine. Government may need to change sometimes, but there's a method for that in America, in the Constitution. It's called an amendment. You bypass that quite often, the way it's happening now, and you just make the changes regardless of the whole idea of rule of law. Rule of law doesn't mean much. And that's where we get to this last point. There's little concern for original intent of founding documents like, let's say, the Constitution. Let me just give you one example of how this did play out in a particular president. Woodrow Wilson was a history, political science professor at Princeton, and then, of course, he becomes governor of New Jersey, then president after that. In one of his books, he lays out his evolutionary view of government. And here's what he says. He says, government is accountable to Darwin, not to Newton. That being Isaac Newton, of course. Living political constitutions, he says, must be Darwinian in structure and in practice. Society is a living organism and must develop. Now, you win a lot of people by making sure they know the society is living, otherwise it's like dead. Okay? So getting the right words can win people over. He says, all that progressives ask or desire is permission, in an era when development, evolution is a scientific word, permission to interpret the Constitution according to that Darwinian principle. All they ask is recognition of the fact that a nation is a living thing and not a machine. Well, personally, I don't think the Founding Fathers looked upon the nation as a machine. But again, when you make this kind of a statement, you can win people over because everybody likes something living. And of course, that gave the impetus to the concept of a living constitution, which certainly sounds a whole lot better than a dead one, right? Okay. Now, this dovetails nicely with where I want to go in the next session, because we're going to go into a philosophy, a worldview that says government is kind of like this too, and it ought to follow more of an evolutionary concept. And that is going to be on the subject of Marxism.